PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
This week on PA Books, Mike Stack, author of City of Brotherly Blood.
We're joined today by former Lieutenant Governor Mike Stack. You wrote this book, City of Brotherly Blood. Just to go back, you were surrounded by politics your entire life. Right. What were your earliest memories of your family's involvement?
Well, it was exciting, you know, because as kids, we got to be open to meeting new people and new situations. And since both my parents were in politics, our house was a very social place, and it was also a tactical place. It was like my dad's ward headquarters. So we constantly had new people coming into our lives, and we had a lot of parties and social events. So we as kids, it was exciting to meet all these new people. And we had all the politicians of the day coming to visit with my father, and we always said, "We know, Dad. Why are these people all acting like he's this important guy that they have to come and meet?" So it was a time of wonder. At the same time, as kids, you know, we had our same as all kids. We had things that we were trying to do in our own lives with school and to get our parents' attention in sports and things like that. And on the one hand, the busyness and the excitement was great, and then on the other hand, it was you were sort of frustrated that you couldn't get your parents' complete attention, and so sometimes that was frustrating. But ultimately, my parents, I think, doubled down to make sure that they came back and checked with each kid to see how are you doing. I know there's a lot of stuff going on in here, but so I would say mostly it was a time of wonder and excitement, and I remember times where we were in charge of doing the coat room for parties, and we were piling what seemed at the time like tons of fur coats down, and then we would run down the hallway and dive onto the bed with the fur coats on them. So it was mostly fun.
You refer to your dad's role as ward leader. For those that live outside of Philadelphia, what's the significance of ward leader? Right.
So ward leader, and I grew up in this culture. For people outside of Philadelphia who are interested in politics, they hear the concept ward leader, and they say, "Oh, I've heard of ward leader," and they're ward bosses. And in the structure of American politics, in a lot of big cities, they call them precinct bosses or precinct captains and that kind of thing. In Philadelphia, I think, is the only place where they mostly still call them wards, and they're areas of electoral responsibility beneath like the regular election process. The ward leader is elected by committee people that are like your district captains, the people that you see on election day that are handing out the flyers. Those are like committee people. So in Philadelphia, it's a little bit blood sport to become a ward leader, and sometimes even in a committee person election, it's a big battle. And for no pay, and for aggravation, and for the opportunity to have voters tell you that they're frustrated and why aren't you doing anything about this? So in Philadelphia, these are the ward bosses, the proverbial back room, smoke-filled room, folks who make the decisions on who the candidates are in the machine system of Philadelphia politics. And then the party chairman, who's almost godlike, as we were growing up, is elected by the ward leaders, and there's 69 of them. So in the days before big media and these well-funded campaigns with slick advertising programs and social media, for God's sake, the ward bosses were the ones that decided who the candidates were, and a lot of times what would happen in an election in a city like Philadelphia, which has so many votes. And at the time, it used to have so many, early on, it had a lot of Republican votes too, Republican and Democratic votes. Either way, Philadelphia and the ward leaders could have huge power in what would happen in an election, not just for a local office, not just for statewide office, but even for the presidency.
You write about your father's run for district attorney. What do you remember about that campaign?
It was really interesting, and it was a step up from the usual fanfare of being a ward leader's son and a ward leader's family, because then we went from sort of being involved in the structure of helping other candidates to helping our father, who was running for office. And so then, just like, the stereotype of the candidate, everybody wants to see the family too. So we were somewhat on display as well as kids. And my dad and mom, wanted us to play a role, and we wanted to play a role. And so we basically got dressed up sort of in costumes. We had like white slacks and white shirts, and we would wear banners that say "Backstack for DA." And it was fun and interesting, and we had some really some wild adventures where we went to the Italian market campaigning with my dad, and we're thinking, we're kids and everything. People are going to be supportive. We're just helping our father. And I think we had a mini string band playing with us one time. And the old Italian ladies who were doing their shopping for vegetables were basically were yelling at us, saying, "You're ruining our day, get out of here." And nobody's for him anyway with my dad. So we got our first taste of that. And as I say in the book, I say, my three sisters and my brother were offended by the whole process. And I sort of was like insulted at the same time as a kid, but also it was exciting, to be in the kind of combat we were in the Italian market, in the middle of all that excitement in a big city like Philadelphia. And then we all became aware that Dad was running against the machine. He had been the machine guy all these years, and he had finally decided, I'm going to run for district attorney. I can make a difference. And the party was not for him. So that was disturbing and hurtful for him, but then he said, I'm not going to back down, I'm going to do it. And I remember my mom and dad say, there's a principle to be had here. We're not going to back down. We're going to go fight the fight. And so we as a family were involved in the campaign. I watched my dad when he made his official announcement, one of the smartest men I've ever met, a really articulate lawyer. And at his announcement for DA, there were a row of microphones in front of him, a big press event, and the press crowded in there. And I remember there was no air conditioning. It was hot, and the lights were glaring. And my dad, when he started making his speech, started stuttering, and his voice started squeaking. I'd never seen him thrown off. And it was like torture for him to get through the speech, and he eventually got the hang of it. But it took a long time. We were sitting there like kids, like we couldn't believe what we were seeing. So I also learned that early lesson. Everything changes once they turn on the lights, and it's for real, and it's a press conference. And then I've noticed that throughout my life in politics, that there are some people who think that they're really great in politics, and then the lights go on and everything changes and they choke a little bit. And then there's others who are sort of natural at it, and there's others who get better at it. But that it does change, and it is a pressure situation. Once again, my siblings, were supportive and interested, but at the same time, they were like, that's enough of that. And I went in a different direction where it was magnetic for me. I was really interested in following Dad around in politics and seeing what was going to be next, and then sort of figuring who was against us and why, and what could we do if the party was ours? Why were we in a fight? And what were our principles to make a difference? But I learned, my parents showed me that you can't be afraid. You have to go out and do it. And if you are afraid, go out and do it anyway.
We're going to jump ahead a little bit.
Okay.
Tell me about the first time that your father suggested that you run for office against Senator Salvatore.
Oh, so this was at a rockier time in my life, and I'd always been, as I said, interested in politics, and I had worked as a young committee person when I was 12 and 13 years old and handing out literature, and I was very early on used to that the Republicans were the opposition, and even though they were our neighbors, we would compete for the voters coming up, and it was your whole day you would be sort of in a conflict with your neighbor over got to win the division. But we would usually in Northeast Philadelphia at that time in our history, we would lose a lot to the Republicans. It's always been sort of a conservative area, and they had some big time famous Republican politicians, including Billy Meehan and Hank Salvatore, who were their party. So Hank Salvatore was sort of this iconic older politician, but really good with the gravitas, and he would come to the polling place and he was like this older movie star, and we couldn't stand it. Because our voters would be attracted to him too. So he always got elected for state representative, and always laid waste to our candidates. And so. Different times in my early 20s, the idea of me running for office came up, but I never saw anything that was attractive to me. And then I was sort of finding my way in life just after graduating college and looking around at jobs, and had some personal issues that I was going through. And my dad said something like, we still don't have a candidate to run against Salvatore for the Senate, because he had beaten like our superstar in Northeast Philadelphia, Jimmy Lloyd, who was this fresh-faced, really smart state senator. Salvatore had defeated him in the Reagan landslide of 1984. So my dad said, we don't have anyone to run against Salvatore. If you can get your act together, we might be able to get you the support to run against Hank. And now most people will be like, why would you send me to that kind of a slaughter? But I thought, this might be an amazing opportunity. And so I buckled down in my life, and I got focused, and I worked hard at finding maturity and getting sort of bad habits under control. And then I did it all because I wanted to run for office, and I thought, if I get a chance to run against Salvatore, I'm going to win. I'm going to try to win. That's another delusion of upcoming politicians. They always think they could win. So I was deluded enough to think I could win, and then I was able to persuade a number of family friends and people around us, and I was lucky to have a lot of people, because of my parents and everything, they wanted to help. And so at first I thought, Dad, you're crazy. And then I thought, Dad, you really understand this. And so it was a very exciting thing to run for the state Senate in 1988. And of course, we did not win, and we did not get slaughtered. We did well. We got 44% of the vote. Politicians always do that, by the way. They always say we. But it really isn't a we. It really is a we, because I had so many people in it with me, helping me. But I was still very disappointed when we lost. But it was a great lesson.
What goes into putting together a campaign and getting people to work for you?
So the way you see it portrayed in television and movies, or you hear about it through urban legend, is it's all these consultants and people who are skilled at the maneuverings of politics. But really what it is, it's like anything in your life. It's whatever you do in life. It's like a bake sale. It's like you're moving. You have to reach out to the people in your circle that you care about and who care about you, and you have to say, I need your help. And I was lucky to have Pat and Jim McGinley, who were my mom and dad's dear friends, and then they became like our family friends through politics, and eventually sort of surrogate parents to me, or aunts and uncles and their family and our family, did a lot of things together. But Pat and Jim McGinley, it's like, in my life, if I were to say anything that if I was in trouble or if I needed help with that, call Pat and Jim, because they were the most loyal, wonderful people, and they'd come running to the rescue. So I asked Pat and Jim to help. My mom and dad helped. Everyone that I knew that I could find, I asked to help, and there were some people that were my friends in life, but they were not interested. And you always find that out, too. You want to know who your real friends are, go run for office. And then people came out of the woodwork, too, that I didn't know really well. They just said that they heard about the campaign and that they wanted to be involved. And that's the great thing about politics, too. People who you have no idea what interests them, but they want to be a part of something, a movement, something special, and they see things in you that you don't see in yourself. And so you really get to know yourself in a different way when you're running for office. You know your shortcomings, but you also learn about your strengths, and people suddenly feel a level of trust with you, that they feel that they can explain to you what they think that you should be doing, that you can do better, and you can take it without hurt feelings, or you try your best to. But that's how you do it. You just ask everyone you know, and you figure it out as it goes along, and that's the beginning of any good campaign.
You write about Frank Salvatore having, quote, dangerous associates. You refer to Roofers Union leader John McCullough, who was shot in his own home, and McCullough's successor, Steve Traits, whose union guys, you write, would throw scabs off of the roof. Were there any times, whether in your political career or even in writing this book, that you questioned campaign decisions or tactics or the level of candor you had for your own personal safety?
Usually after I had said or done something, then I would regret it. But I would say, there was an Inquirer writer by the name of Bill Miller, and he referred to me as a political neophyte, and I didn't know what that meant. I thought it was an insult, but it really meant like somebody who's new, and also probably doesn't know that much, and maybe borderline naive. So even though I had my father, who was clearly someone who was no babe in the woods in Philadelphia politics, and my mom, because they had been through many campaigns, I had that kind of advice, but I didn't know everything, and they didn't know everything. And so Senator Salvatore, as a lot of Philadelphia politicians are, have all kinds of connections, sometimes that you're not aware of. And there have been many Philadelphia politicians who've had tangential connections to the mob, and the mob was bigger back then. And I'm not speaking out of school. When we think about Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters and the influence of racketeering in that big union, it certainly had made its way to some unions in Philadelphia. But at the time, Steve Traits was sort of a notorious figure, and there was this big scandal called the roofer scandal in Philadelphia, which involved, a mass bribery scheme for very low dollar amounts that swept away a lot of judges. They were basically Christmas gifts of cash to judges in Philadelphia, which I'm sure all of them in their better judgment would have said, take that Christmas gift with you, but I appreciate you stopping by. Anyway, that was the big controversy that happened, and a lot of judges got in trouble with that. And so 30B, Roofers 30B, was notorious for that. In that backdrop, Steve Traits, who was the business agent, which is another way of saying the most important person in the union, had succeeded to the union head after John McCullough, who was the leader of 30B, had been gunned down by an assassin on Bustleton Avenue, literally 10 minutes from where I live. So I remember the stuff going on, but I wasn't really wrapping my head around it. And so word came in that Salvatore had accepted money from 30B after all this happened and people went to prison. And I thought, that's something that voters would want to know about. So basically we ran one mailing that said, Salvatore is the only elected official in Pennsylvania who accepted a contribution from the notorious local 3030B. I thought that was fair. However, then I was in my district, going to places and meeting people I'd never met before, many of them in organized labor, and other people who, I don't know what their associations were, but I definitely felt a level of, now I'm in a little bit of danger, because people were leering at me, or people would turn their back to me as I walked by. And I said, what's going on here, to a few others? And they said, well, you took on a very dangerous guy. What did you expect? And then it started settling into me that, sure, you have to be careful what you say. I would have said it again, but I just would have been more prepared emotionally. And, you can criticize people for one thing, and they'll often, if they're up to other things, they get defensive because they think you're talking about a bunch of other things that they might have done. But that's the danger of open politics and challenging people. Now, did I ever say that it's categorically true that Hank Salvatore is somehow corrupt? No, I didn't say that. But people care about your associations in politics, so I thought it was fair game. Nonetheless, you have to be careful speaking the truth. I always want to speak the truth, but it can get dangerous. And then, so in my book, I sort of have, in City of Brotherly Blood, blood splattering, and I use, as you know, Francine, I use that terminology for emotional reactions to people too, that it gets bloody. People get angry and disturbed and afraid and want to hurt you. And I've always thought, we don't kill each other in campaigns in this country. That's what makes America great. But it's a good thing we have a democracy with a protected system, because you can see how people's feelings and their security could lead them to commit violence in politics.
As you mentioned, your father was well-known and politically connected. At what point in your career did you feel like you stepped out of his shadow and you were being recognized for your own merits? Right.
So the amazing thing was that my dad was a relentless mentor to me, and I had a reputation in my family for being super sensitive, and plus I would get framed in the family too. If I was upset, they'd be like, "He's so sensitive." So while I was so sensitive, I was still leaning towards a tough business and being in politics, and so when I lost that first race, I felt bitter and I felt disappointed, but I also felt like, I can do this. I can make a difference, and I think I'd like to do it again. And so I never had to say to my dad, "Dad, I hope you'll be thinking, give me another shot," because he said right after we lost that campaign, he said, "You're going to have to keep in mind everybody who's in this room." This was at our defeat party when I gave a concession speech. He said, "Because we're going to need everybody in 4 years." And so he was already talking about the next campaign. And literally for the next 4 years after I lost, we were always sort of referring to when the next campaign comes up. And it was always going to be the Senate. After we lost to Salvatore the first time, we're like, we're going to have to be ready for Salvatore in 4 years. And it sort of became the culture in our household. And I think my brother and my sisters, and fairly so, were probably a little jealous, because they were like, are we going to have to hear about Michael and his quest to beat Salvatore again? So anyway, that was stepping out of the shadow, long story short. My dad also convinced me to run for council after I lost to Salvatore for a second time. And I thought, haven't I been a good son to you, Dad? Why do you want me to go and lose these races? And I lost another relatively close race for council at large. And then the run for the Senate for a third time against Sumter would have been my fourth loss in this race. And this was in 2000. And then everything came together. And I talk about it a lot in the book, how it was a nail biter and how it all came together in that race and the stars aligned. And then after we won that race, and I was standing on the stage, and the balloons were going up, and the confetti was dropping, and I saw the people who loved me in the auditorium, and my parents looking at me, and I thought, I've done it. I thought, I'm gonna step out of it, because my dad's shadow was always there, you know. And at times I was proud of it, you know. That people would say hello to your father all the time, and then at other times I was a little jealous of it. But when we won that race, then I knew I was going to be standing in my own shoes, and I was going to get things done. And realistically, it was a great moment, but it did create a little different aspect in our relationship, which became a sort of a stressful situation at times. But amazing to have that moment to step out there and know, now I'm going to go be a senator, I'm going to go be a leader, and the stuff that my dad's taught me all these years, now I can put into action.
For those that may not be familiar, can you talk a little bit about former Senator Vince Fumo and your relationship with him? Right.
So he's one of the most interesting men you could meet, and in Philadelphia he was. I don't want to say notorious, because he was counted on, and he was the most important senator in the city, and maybe in the state, maybe in the country. And he had a brass knuckle style, so he preferred to be feared than loved. And so in Philadelphia folklore, his nickname was actually the Vince of Darkness, because he was so potentially evil and frightening to people. He allegedly had a close relationship with Hank Salvatore, and that he would work with Salvatore in the Senate because he was a Republican, and Vince was a part of the minority party and always needed to get things done, so he would work with Salvatore. So Vince, we perceived right from the get-go that Senator Fumo was not for Mike Stack. He was for his friend, the Republican. Now, Vince would probably say, you're making this up, or I wasn't against you, I just wasn't for you. And the same thing happened in 1992, where he wasn't against me, he says, he just wasn't for me. From our camp and our point of view, we felt he was against us, and he was doing things to help Salvatore and prevent me from winning. So I always saw Vince as this notorious figure. At the same time, I admired him because he was so powerful, and Congressman Brady, who was our party chairman, would, and still is, would always say, here's the guy who brings home the bacon. And at the big party events, they'd bring Fumo up on the stage, and everybody'd be like, that's the most powerful guy. And then I would be watching from in the crowd saying, and he's the guy who's going to prevent me from ever winning. So I never thought he'd be my friend. The stars aligned in 2000. He and Salvatore ended up having a feud. And Vince Fumo turned on Salvatore and summoned me to his Tasker Street compound and asked me to bring my father, because they had some issues too. And then Vince basically told me, he said, you haven't been my cup of tea, but this guy was my friend. He's not my friend anymore, and I'm going to get him for what he's done to me, and I'm going to get him using you. How's that sound? So I, of course, answered, that sounds good. And then he became my friend. And then he helped put me over the top, and he was giddier than I was when we won. And then I showed up in the Capitol. A nice boy like me, Mike Stack, I had a big brother named Vince Fumo, who was a very tough guy. So I immediately had credibility when I got to Harrisburg, and things were easier for me because I could rely on Vince to show me the way, and he became my chief mentor, taking over sort of from my dad. And my dad rightly said, listen to Vince. And Vince has been good to you, so be good to Vince. And then Vince, of course, ended up in a big federal investigation and indictment, and eventually went to prison. And so there's more in the book about how I continue that relationship with Vince, including visiting him in federal prison. And he continued to give me guidance which was helpful. And he's my friend to this day, although at different periods of time we've had stresses where he's disagreed with how I've handled myself in my career, including he never wanted me to run for lieutenant governor. He wanted me to stay in the Senate and become leader. But what he never would understand was we had tried that several times, and I talk about in the book, and we felt like it wasn't going to be something I could do, and I wanted to make a bigger difference. But then there's some funny stuff about how Vince and I have disagreed, but ultimately he's one of the best friends I ever had in politics.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Since you referred to him wanting you to become leader, can you talk a little bit about what happens in those closed-door meetings during leadership elections and the political maneuvering that's involved there? Right.
So Senator Mike Opaque was one of our older senators in 2000 and let me see, this is 2010, and 2012. Senator Opaque was respected. He was the Senate caucus whip, and he referred to these leadership elections as very distasteful. And he had been in the Senate for years and he knew everyone. He said, suddenly all these people that you've spent a lot of time with, that you like, that you respect, everybody becomes sneaky and spiteful and are making side deals and being dishonest. And he said, it's very unbecoming of us, and it's really hard to be around it. So he described it that way. And in our caucus, when I decided to run for leader, we had only 20 members. So it's an election to win over 19 more people. And things can change in a matter of minutes. People can run into somebody in the hallway and change their mind. And so it's a very, it's a nerve-wracking type thing. And it's the funny thing about it, it's important who becomes leader or who becomes appropriation chair, and you count on these 19 people, and literally you have to be available 24/7 and watching all the time. And literally, when I was running for leader, I would stand on my balcony looking out in the Capitol hallways, and we would watch who was going where, who was going into what offices. And literally, too, my staff guys would come back from the cafeteria and say, guess who we saw talking? So it becomes like high school, but with a lot on the line. And it's maddening, it's disappointing. You get to see everybody's shortcomings and they get to see yours. And then when the election's over, you need to become friends again because you've got the people's business. And the sad part is you don't necessarily become friends again. You always remember these little battles. And most of the insults that you say go from being behind their back and theirs behind your back to eventually you say it to each other's faces, and rarely do people get over those types of things.
One noteworthy vote that occurred during your time as senator was the legislative pay raise. Can you talk just briefly about how you learned about it and the fallout that ensued afterwards?
Right. So there probably couldn't be a more controversial thing that happened in my Senate career, and it realistically it was ominous how it snuck up on us. So I was a new senator, and a new senator wants to do good things, but the most important thing, and this is just quite frankly, a new senator wants to get reelected, so you don't want to do anything stupid. And I had actually campaigned against Salvatore in 1988 on a legislative pay raise that he took, and he caught a lot of grief on that particular argument. So I always remembered the voters, if they don't understand any other legislative issue, they understand that they're working for a living and they're trying to make ends meet. And then the perception that legislators or politicians, they're probably do-nothing politicians in Harrisburg, right? You can't overwhelm that. You can't beat that cliche that everyone's going to start with. So I knew pay raises are a dangerous thing. But I was minding my own business on the Senate floor, the beautiful Senate floor, and I was during a recess or a break, and I was called into our caucus room. I forget who called me in. It was a staffer, and I went in, and it was just me, and it was Senator Mello and Senator Fumo, and they basically sort of surrounded me. Both put an arm on my shoulder, and they said, "We're going to make you some money." And I said, "Well, that sounds good. What's happening?" And of course, I'm always going to take that but I'm going to be listening carefully. So Vince said, and I know Vince is super smart, and Bob Mello, who's our Democratic leader, he's smart, and these guys have been leading this operation for years, so I figure they know what's going on. And I said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Well, we're going to go for a legislative pay raise." And Jubileer, who was at the time I think the majority leader of the Republican caucus, Jubileer's on board. He's going to give us some votes from the Republican caucus. We're going to get some votes, and you may be able to vote for it, but you're getting a pay raise. And so I walked out. I just sort of nodded, right? And I walked out and I saw Sean Logan, who was a brand new senator too. And he said, "Did they tell you what they were doing?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "What do you think?" I said, "I don't know." And he said, "I don't know either. I don't think this is going to work out." I said, "Well, they must think it is because they're so smart." Anyway, it ended up, I didn't vote for the pay raise. And eventually I was one of the people who, you got an automatic pay raise, but eventually I gave back the portion that was in my pay. But it became the biggest fiasco in political history. It wiped out the two top leaders for the Republicans, Jubileer and Chip Wright Bill. It took out a Supreme Court justice eventually in Russell Nigro. And 40-some legislators lost their jobs from this pay raise, and people still talk about it today. But the rage of the voters was not just the pay raise, but the way it was voted. The procedure was you could vote these things. We used to have all-night sessions, and I think we voted this in the middle of the night, and it was really perceived as being sneaky. But to their credit, the voters, they rose up. And not so much in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, they're so cynical. They were like, "Whatever. Of course they're gonna do this to us." But across the state, it became a huge movement. I think it built a lot of grassroots involvement, and maybe in the long run, it was people need to pay attention to that stuff more. And we changed a lot of things. We had a lot of reform movements for many years, but that was the biggest thing that I learned too. In the legislative game, no matter how young I am, no matter how new I am, I need to really not just take it verbatim from my leaders that this is a good thing, it's an acceptable thing, and this is all going to work out. Ultimately, I've got to evaluate it on my own and make sure I make the best possible decision.
What ultimately motivated you to run for lieutenant governor for 2012?
Right. So this is sort of personal in that my father, who had been my mentor all these years, had been developing issues with heart disease. He actually had a heart attack about a week after my second loss. And it was a severe heart attack, and he almost died from it. And I remember sort of blaming myself, thinking, if I had not had to have these political dreams and drag the whole family into it, and my father, that maybe he wouldn't have had this heart attack. And he eventually, of course, he survived the heart attack, and then he had other issues after that developed, congestive heart failure and diabetes and other things. So his health was declining over the years. And I dreaded the day that I would have to say goodbye to him, because I felt like I'm going to lose the person who has brought me so far. And so it was one of his last hospitalizations, and I was getting to the reality that at some point he was going to go to God. And as much as it scared me, I was having more heart-to-hearts with him. And we talked about his boyhood and his dreams and his disappointments and the things that made him proud, as close as we could. Because my dad was still sort of, he was raised by Irish immigrants, so he wasn't necessarily, he didn't have it all out there emotionally, but he had gotten closer to that over the years. And he said, you know, you've had some success here as a senator, and you've surpassed some people, and you should think about yourself in terms of an important leader who can give more to the state, and it's important that you put your name out there as someone who should be considered for governor, because it's something that you could do. So I considered doing it. I said, I'll do it, Dad. I'll put my name out there. And I thought in my mind, I'm going to do this, but I'm not ready necessarily to run for governor. And I'm still figuring out my Senate role. And then we were at the Pennsylvania Society in New York. And I basically had one or two staffers scramble around and say that I was thinking about running for governor to a couple of key people, maybe a reporter here and there. And I remember my wife and I came off the elevator at the Waldorf Astoria on a Saturday night, and everybody was in the lobby, and all these people stormed up to me saying, "I heard you're running for governor." And it was a whole different ball game. And I wanted to say, no, I'm just putting my name in. I'm just creating buzz. I'm not running. I didn't say I was running for governor. And it was a whole different energy, and I knew it was the big time, and it was intimidating. It was exhilarating and exciting, too. And so a little bit of momentum picked up from there, and my name got put into a couple polls, and one Quinnipiac poll had me beating Tom Corbett, who was having a hard time as governor at the time. And I thought, how could they even know my name? And so I was perceived as someone who could run for governor. And as I said, I didn't know where the finance was going to come from. And I came into my house one day and I said to my wife, I don't know where this finance is going to come from for this gubernatorial race. She said, excuse me? I said, I don't know where the money's going to come from for the gubernatorial race. She said, you're just putting your name in the mix. You're not running for governor. And I was, oh, yeah. So then I was trying to figure out what the next move was. And I'd raised a substantial amount of money for a state senator, not, in my opinion, enough to run for governor. And then a couple of consultants and other people came and said, you know what, with the amount of money you've raised, with the profile that you have, you should consider running for lieutenant governor, because you'd probably win easily. And then you wouldn't have to do anything. It'd be a very easy job, and all you'd have to do is go around with that nice smile of yours and help the governor if the governor wants you to help. And you could get out of your Senate caucus where you've had some issues with your members, the leadership, turf wars, and so forth. So I thought, that sounds like a good idea. I can stay in politics, do something different, and not have it be risk averse. So that's what led me to run for lieutenant governor. But mostly I went down the statewide road out of my dad thinking that it was something I should do, and then sort of my vision of myself as a leader for Pennsylvania caught up to me after I was actually in the trenches.
Talk a little bit about your relationship with your running mate and then eventually Governor Tom Wolf.
So when I was trying to decide whether to run for lieutenant governor, the consultant that I had on my 2000 campaign was a guy named Ken Snyder. And I write about Ken Snyder versus Howard Kane, who were both essentially Vince Fumo consultants. And they both argued about being involved in my campaign or whether it was a good idea. And Howard Kane always said, Mike Stack can win. We just have to stick with him, even though I was down by 70 points in the polls. And Snyder was the guy who was always saying, he can't win. Why are we wasting our time in this race? So then eventually we got so close in the race when Vince Fumo was about to pull out of it, Ken Snyder said, "You better not pull out of this race. Mike Stack can win." He flipped and he became an advocate. And then he was the one who showed up. Vince Fumo had been indicted, had gone to prison, and Ken Snyder disappeared from Philadelphia. And the next time I heard about him is when he called me up. He was in Chicago working as a political consultant, and he's one of the guys to say, "I think if you run for lieutenant governor, you could win." So I had a meeting with him, and he said, "Allison Schwartz is going to win for governor. It's a fact." And she was the well-known senator from Philadelphia, and senator congresswoman. And if you run for lieutenant governor, I think you could win. I said, "It's impossible. It'd be two Philadelphians. The rest of the state wouldn't go for it." And he said, "It doesn't matter. Philadelphia has most of the votes. You'll both win, and then you'll go around and just do whatever she tells you to do. And if she tells you to lean against the wall and look nice, you do that. If she tells you to go get into a fight with somebody, you go do that." And I said, "Okay, I'll do it." So the whole world was, from Philadelphia's standpoint, was Allison Schwartz is going to win. And then Tom Wolf came out of nowhere. And he had a lot of money from his family business. And I remember he said to me, literally, he said, I said, "Tom, you really have run a great campaign." He said, "Well, Mike, I had $10 million. And he didn't add much more to it other than, we used to say that in Philadelphia, money talks and BS walks. Mm-hmm. So that's basically what he was saying to me. So he ended up well outspending a lot of other candidates, including Allison Schwartz, who fired her finance people because they couldn't raise the money, because no one could keep up with Tom Wolf on the finance. And he had a real simple message, which was, "Hey, I'm a regular guy. I drive a Jeep. I work at I own a furniture store in my family business, and I'm a good guy." And that worked. And with all the clutter of the other candidates, we thought Tom Wolf's going to win this thing easily. And it's going to work out for us because we think we're going to win easily. And then we won't have to deal with the two Philadelphia people. We'll have Tom Wolf from Central PA and you from Philly. And a lot of people said right off the bat, they said, "This is perfect for Wolf because you're experienced in the Senate in Philadelphia and all that stuff. So you can help him do things that he wouldn't want to do, that are distasteful, getting votes out of the Senate." So we thought it was going to be a dream team. But what we found out right off the bat, whether it was the people around him, his staffers and supporters, that they mistrusted Philadelphia. They didn't like the Philly party, and they saw me as a party guy. And right off the bat, without me opening my mouth or doing anything, there was this distrust of me. And that was on the campaign trail. We felt that. And then that as much as when in my own private dealings with Tom Wolf, we started off, everything seemed fine, that there was always this undercurrent that he and his team found me distasteful, and which I didn't mind at first in the race, because I thought, it doesn't matter. I'll just go and be a good soldier and try and stay out of the way, because I knew how to do that as a senator, right? Sometimes you just know your role and you say, "I'm not going to be the one carrying the ball here," and I understood that. And I'd just wait by the phone. If he needed me to do something, I'd do it. Otherwise, I would act like I was still in the Senate and see my colleagues and do that kind of thing and look for opportunities to help them. So that's the relationship. We sensed it was tepid off the bat, and we were correct.
During your time as lieutenant governor, both you and your wife, Tanya, were subject of investigations within the Inspector General's office. Can you talk a little bit about how those affected you and your wife, and a little bit of the surrounding circumstances there?
Right. So it was interesting. It was a little Alice in Wonderland, because she was not a state employee. And she sort of had a ceremonial, she had a ceremonial title as the second lady. And when I would introduce her in public, I'd say the second lady. And so she, from a protocol standpoint, she had a role in state government, but she was not a state employee. And so we sort of, just our understanding of how the Inspector General's office worked, and this has been me as a state senator, and a member of the Appropriations Committee, I'd been involved in funding them and understanding their role. I had never seen them involved in, first of all, a non-employee of the Commonwealth, and then secondly, with an elected official. So I was thrown off by that, and it shook us up immediately from the get-go. But for her in particular, because she felt like, from her background, and as a private citizen, she felt like suddenly there was this big force of an investigation upon her specifically, and she was named in the media and so forth. So it was very emotionally upsetting to her, and something that I discovered in our marriage, that she had all kinds of childhood trauma that had to do with this whole power, unfair distribution, where overwhelming, crushing, and so this stuff started coming up again. And I felt immediately like I didn't understand why there had to be some kind of big public investigation. In fact, I knew there shouldn't have been, that anything that needed to be discussed could have been discussed in private, and resolutions found. So I thought it was some kind of political hit job from the beginning. Nonetheless, I'm the big boy, and I'm the politician, and I'm from Philadelphia, right? So in Philadelphia, most of the people that I had come up in politics with had been the subject of probes and investigations, and I always thought, I'm not that guy, but I'm from Philadelphia. But people said to me, you're from Philadelphia, count on being investigated at some point. So the time had come. And I wasn't federally investigated like my leaders, like Senator Mello, who was federally indicted, Senator Musto, Senator Fumo, Senator Fumo's cousin, all these people, Senator Farnese, had been investigated by the FBI and ended up in federal trials, and then Vince went to prison and others. So, but people would always say about you in Philadelphia, they would whisper down the line, they'd say, it had gotten back to us before this investigation came out that people were saying, Stack's going to be under investigation. So then we discovered here was the investigation. It wasn't the FBI or anything like that. It was the Inspector General's office. So it shook us up. To make a long story short, it shook us up, but we were able to make our way through a very challenging time. And the important thing was, as much as we were both emotionally upset, and nobody's perfect, right? And we all have to, and I was totally willing, she was totally willing to admit a lot of our shortcomings whenever necessary. We pulled together as a couple and survived it, and are still married today and happily. And it just shows you that politics is a very tough business, and you never know when you're going to end up in a controversy, and you can't, life is not a bowl of cherries. So I always say that to young people too. I say, you hear stuff on social media and you feel like you're outraged. It's not about, you say that's not true, it's a lie and all that. Just make your way through it. And try not to be reactive. And silence is golden sometimes. And so it was a storm, and the storm passed. And I tell you what, it made us both better people to go through a very challenging and tough time. And, you want things to be different. A lot of times you want your career to go in a different direction. But at the end of the day, we both sort of felt like God has a plan, and God wants to show us some new stuff. And every challenge is like that. And that was an example, a challenge that showed us a lot of better things about ourselves and how to have a better life.
We're running short on time, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. You completed your first term as lieutenant governor, were not reelected, then you moved to the West Coast. Can you talk briefly about what you were doing and how you got involved in entertainment? Yeah.
So, great. So mostly when I was going to walk away from politics at one point, I started doing plays, community theater, and even some stand-up comedy in Philadelphia. So when my dad brought up running for the Senate, I was like, wait, I might go into acting and entertainment. And then I won my race, so I didn't get a chance to be in show business, except political show business. So when I wasn't reelected, Tanya thought, let's go to California and you can go be an actor and try to go back into stand-up comedy and stuff. And at the time, I was still in the disappointment of electoral fallout and felt traumatized by a lot of the tough stuff that happened. And I thought, people think I'm crazy if I do that. And she said, what do you care? You know, you've got a new lease. You're free to go and do these things. So I continued to have my residence in Philadelphia, but spent a great deal of time on the West Coast. And people from politics in Philadelphia found out that I was doing entertainment and had done a luxury home show and some other things, and they wrote stories about them, but the political columnists. And so my wife's reaction was, they're really doing you a big favor because now people know you're in show business and you're a politician. So it was a big difference in my life. And I've done it to this day. I have an agent and a manager, and I've done some pretty interesting stuff in film, and have performed in Hollywood and at the Ice House, which is a big comedy store out in LA. And I've had some really great experiences, and it's also helped me write comically. And we also have a screenplay sort of based on the book, but also has some comedic stuff and some more off-the-wall aspects of our characters. So it's been an amazing thing to do. I essentially consider myself bi-coastal now. I'm still a Philly kid. I vote in Philly. I pay my taxes in Philly. I do jobs in Philly, but I do act and do comedy on the West Coast. And I've run into people who weren't interested in me politically, but found out that I was doing it and have been very encouraged, saying, you go, boy, because if anyone can go from politics to showbiz, you're the one. So it's also a quest. So I don't give up politics necessarily, but I think in politics, we need people who are doing other stuff, being involved in the arts, taking a chance. And so it's been very liberating and fun.
What inspired you to write a memoir at this time?
I had a lot of stuff I wanted to get off my chest, and it was at times painful to think about. And in the aftermath of politics and some of the tough things that had happened, I'm like a lot of people, I had sort of a PTSD effect. I felt traumatized. I had trouble sleeping. I felt really hurt and heartbroken about what had been my love for years, that I felt like it was stripped away from me. And at the same time, when I would try to articulate my feelings, it would ignite everything again, and I'd be rehashing bad things that had happened, and I felt very upset. So I started journaling my feelings and my breathing, and eventually processing some of the things that have happened in my life and how I was raised, and then how being in the political drama, and a narrative of interest started forming. And I said, this is something that people would like to hear. And first it was to write to get it off my chest. And then I started seeing a narrative where I thought, this is a story people would be interested in hearing, and they would find it historical. And then for kids who have had to deal with disappointments and ups and downs and reinvention, I said, this could make a difference in people's lives. And plus, I love Philadelphia, and it's a city of beauty and tragedy, and never-ending self-inflicted wounds. And I thought, the drama of the city of Philadelphia and the characters in our town haven't been talked about enough. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'd love to talk about them, and with the backdrop of the city, and then at the same time, from the perspective of someone who's been through the rough and tumble and has come out the other end and loves it. So I was grateful, and I'm grateful to my publisher, Sunbury Press, and Lawrence Knorr, for taking a chance on me and being very encouraging in writing the book.
We've been speaking with former Lieutenant Governor Mike Stack, author of this book, City of Brotherly Blood. Thank you for joining us.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.